The clerk wrote one line in blue ink. Boiler, engine, and wheels. $300. 200 people watched it get written, and nearly all of them were laughing. Under that one line, there were three things nobody standing in that yard knew. Nobody knew that the machine had a second whistle cord on her, braided out of wire by hand, hanging 20 inches below the first, rigged for a pair of hands that could not reach. Nobody knew that a small brass plate was buried under 6 coats of paint at the driver's left shoulder, with a date on it and a line of scripture under the date. And nobody knew that 4 blocks from that yard, there was a woman of 82 who would hear that whistle before the summer was out and start crying at her kitchen sink without being able to say why. The woman selling the machine was named Rosalind Garrity. She was 44 years old, and she was taking apart her grandfather's company, one lot at a time, to pay a bank. She called the machine junk. She set it into a microphone. The man buying it was named Dane Vickery. He was 54. He fixed boilers for a living, and he had just spent every dollar he had saved toward a tool he needed. He had a 13-year-old son beside him counting out $300 in $20 bills. A $300 machine with a condemned tag wired to the lever. 16 days on a calendar. And one man willing to look under a footplate that nobody had looked under in 55 years. The thing she called junk was worth $465,000. 3 generations of her own family had owned it. So how did she not know? Stay with him. The cheapest thing Dane Vickery bought that morning turned out to be the only thing nobody could take away from him. The $300 had been sitting in a coffee can above his parts washer since March. It was not spending money. It was most of what he and his son had put aside toward one tool. A gauge that reads how much steel is left in a boiler without cutting the boiler open. With one, Dane could bid on inspection work. Without one, only repairs. Repairs pay less. So that can was the difference between the shop growing and the shop staying exactly where it was. And now it was empty. Dane owned 2 bays and a gravel lot on the east edge of a mill town in Connecticut. The sign said Vickery Boiler and Welding. He kept the heat on in 3 schools. He kept the steam up at a packing plant. And he kept a church boiler alive that should have been replaced back in 1980. That one on Sundays, and he never sent a bill for it. 3 people drew a paycheck from him. The woman who ran his office had circled a date on the wall calendar in red pen. 16 days. That was when the shop's license came due and the bond behind it. The license that let Dane put his own name at the bottom of an inspection report. Miss it, and he could not legally lay a hand on a boiler in that state. Not a school, not the plant, not the church. 16 days, and he had just spent the tool money on a green machine with a condemned tag on it. His son's name was Arlo. He was 13. He came along because he came along to everything on Saturdays. He carried a spiral notebook with the corners gone soft. When a job started, Arlo wrote down the time. That was the rule in the house, and it had not come from Dane. It had come from Arlo's mother. Maeve Vickery kept the shop's books for 11 years. She died 5 years ago on an ordinary Tuesday, between the bank and the hardware store, of a bleed in her brain. She was 49. She had one rule, and she never bent it. Write the ticket before you pick up the wrench. Dane asked her about it once. He thought it was about billing. It isn't about billing, she said. The man who writes it down afterward is arguing. The man who writes it first is just telling the truth. Hold on to that sentence. He was going to need it in 11 days, and he did not know it yet. Before we go any further, tell me what town you are listening in. Put it in the comments. There is a reason I am asking, and it will make sense to you by the end of this. Because the next morning, Dane went back to that machine with a flashlight, and she started telling him things. He photographed the invoice before he photographed the engine. Then the number stamped on her boiler. Then the maker's number cast into her cylinder. Then all four sides of her. He did all of it while 200 people were still standing around, because a photograph taken in front of witnesses is worth more than one taken later in an empty shop. Arlo wrote down each picture as it was taken. Number, time, who was standing there. He also asked the auction yard to keep its camera running until his trailer gate shut. Nobody could ever say he had swapped anything on the way home. Then Dane made a phone call. Elwood Fry was 73, and he had spent 26 years as a state boiler inspector before he retired. He had signed off on every school boiler Dane ever put a hand on. When Elwood said a thing was so, nobody in that county argued about it. Dane asked him to come and look at her before anybody asked either of them to prove anything. The next morning they went looking for what she had to say. They found 4 things, and they were all in the same handwriting, so to speak. The first was the cord. 7 strands of wire, braided by hand, with a little wooden handle on the end. Nobody had hidden it. Somebody had tucked it up out of the way, and it had stayed tucked. The handle was worn on one side only, the underside. Wood wears on the underside when it gets pulled downward, by somebody standing lower than the man the machine was built for. The second was on her firebox. 6 bolt heads down the left side had a shallow cross cut into them, a little X chiseled by hand. That is a shop mark. A man replaced those bolts and cut a mark in every one, so whoever came after him would know which were his. Think about what that means. A man does not cut a mark into a bolt he means to hide. He cuts it so the next man can find exactly where he stood and check his work. Somebody wanted to be checked. The third was a patch. A steel plate the size of a dinner tray riveted onto her left side, and the rivets sat closer together than any factory would have bothered with. Somebody wanted that patch to outlast him. The fourth was under the paint. Dane cleaned nothing off. He wet a cotton swab with solvent and took the paint off one strip of the cab sheet, 2 fingers wide and no wider. There is a difference between reading a machine and restoring one, and the difference is that reading it leaves everything where you found it. The letters came up out of the green a few at a time. A small brass plate riveted flat at the driver's left shoulder, where a man would look 100 times a day without ever meaning to. Arlo read it out loud. The fire shall try every man's work, of what sort it is. He stopped. 1 Corinthians, chapter 3, verse 13. Under the verse, in smaller letters, Ledbetter and Sons Boiler Works. And under that, the year she was built. 1919. What does it mean? Dane wiped the swab on his trouser leg and took his time, because there was a version of that answer that was a sermon, and he had no use for it. It means you don't get to say what your work is, he said. The fire says it. The boy wrote the verse in his notebook, under the date, the way he wrote everything else. Somebody had bolted a promise to the side of that machine. Then 6 men painted over it. And in 9 days, a lawyer was going to send Dane a letter telling him not to touch the thing he had paid for. Elwood filled her with water and pumped her up cold. Not steam, water. Water does not explode. That is the whole reason you test with it. You fill her, you push the pressure past anything she will ever see in service, and then you walk around her looking for a bead of water where a bead of water should not be. He took her a quarter above her working pressure. He held her there. He watched. She held. Nothing wept. Nothing moved. Dane borrowed a thickness gauge from a friend at the packing plant, the same tool the coffee can had been filling up for, and walked it over her barrel and her side sheets. The numbers came back, thick. Thick enough to argue with anybody. They lit her on the 4th Saturday in August, kindling first, then split oak, then coal. For 11 minutes the needle did not move at all. Arlo kept looking at his father, and his father kept not looking back. Then it started to climb. Slow, and then not slow, the way a tide comes in. A little under an hour, cold to working pressure. That is what a machine like her does when her flues are clean and nobody is in a hurry. Dane did not replace one original pipe. He capped them and ran temporary line alongside, so that if anybody ever asked how the water got from her tank to her boiler in 1919, the answer would still be bolted to the machine. Rosalind sent a man to watch. Dane handed him the log and made him photograph every number on her before he laid a hand on any part of it. He got as far as her left side and stopped. He crouched in front of that patch with the tight rivets and did not get up for a while. At 210 pounds of steam, Dane opened the valve and pulled the top cord. The grown man's cord. The whistle on her was a 3-chime. 3 brass bells, one note laid over another. It came out of that stack and went through the shop windows and across the whole valley, and it did not stop for 8 full seconds. Arlo took one step backward. Then he made himself stand still and listen. 4 blocks over, a woman who had been 11 years old in 1955 put a dish down in the sink and did not pick it up again. She stood there with wet hands and cried, and she could not have told you why. She had not heard that sound in 71 years. Here is what this channel is for, and this story is most of the reason. Somebody ought to look at a thing properly before it gets written off as scrap. If you agree with that, hit subscribe, because somebody in that valley had just recognized that whistle. And the company that sold it for $300 was about to find out what it was. Somebody had filmed it through the fence. 40 seconds, sideways, the sound blown out to nothing. By Tuesday, it had gone around 4,000 times in a group for men who collect old steam. On Wednesday, the company put out a statement. They called her an assembled display object of undetermined origin. 9 days earlier, they had called her a lot number and sold her for $300. On Thursday, a letter came. 2 pages of careful language, signed by the company's lawyer, and underneath all of it, one sentence. Do not touch the thing you paid for. Dane took the letter to Bernadette Kiley. She had practiced law in that county for 31 years before she retired. She was 68. And for 12 of those years, Dane had been keeping the boiler alive under her church, on Sundays, for nothing. She read the invoice twice and the letter once. They're not saying you stole it, she said. They're saying both of you were wrong about what it was. That is a real argument, and it does not care one bit whether they behaved well. Then she gave him the other thing, the part he was actually paying her for, in church boilers. You knew she wasn't a display piece before you handed over the money. I did. You didn't know what she was. No. Then say it in that order. To everybody who ever asks you, for the rest of your life. She closed the folder. You didn't owe them your eyes before you paid. From here on, you owe every fact a window. That afternoon, they sealed the bay she stood in and had the inventory witnessed and signed. Rosalind came on a Wednesday, and she came without her lawyer. She stood outside that sealed bay a while, looking in at the machine through the glass. My board wants it back. Your board sold it. My grandfather bought her and a lot of yard equipment. My father wrote her down wrong in the book. My father died 14 months ago. She said it flat, not asking for anything. 41 people get their severance out of what that yard brings in. That was the moment Dane understood what he was actually up against. Nobody at that company hated him. Nobody had schemed. A man in a hurry wrote one line in a book, and a woman in a hurry never went inside the building. Hurry is not the same thing as malice, and it is harder to argue with. A man who means you harm has at least looked at you. A company in a hurry has not looked at anything. She was not a thief. She was trying to keep a promise to 41 people whose names he would never know, which made it worse, not better. "We can offer you $85,000, she said. "You keep the $300 story. We take the engine. Nobody admits anything." $80,000. That was the license. That was the bond. That was a roof on the shop. An account with Arlo's name on it. And the first full night's sleep in 3 weeks. He had $300 in that machine and 11 days left on the calendar. And it was being offered before one rivet on her had been authenticated by anybody. Which meant she was not buying the machine at all. She was buying the 4 months he did not have. "Will you keep her together?" Dane asked. "Boiler, engine, and wheels, all one machine. I won't tie the company's hands before we know what each piece is worth on its own." "Then no." Rosalind looked up at the water stain on his ceiling. "You are risking a great deal for something nobody has proved." "So are you." 2 days later, the state archive called. And what they had in a box in the back changed the whole question. The woman who ran the state's industrial archive was Harriet Coulter. She was 59, she had run that archive 19 years, and she was the person both sides had agreed to let look. She made them wear cotton gloves and work under a fixed camera, and she would not say the word authentic. Not once, however many times Dane came at it sideways. She said the word record over and over, like a woman setting a plumb line. 6 boxes came out onto a steel table. And in the second box, August of 1955 came out with them. Every man over 70 in that part of Connecticut can still tell you where he was standing. 2 hurricanes came through that month, 6 days apart. The second one put down 14 inches of rain in 30 hours, and the rivers came over everywhere at once. 87 people died in that state. In Danestown, the power station went under at 2 in the morning. The fire department's gasoline pump drowned right at the curb. And a mill superintendent with no electricity, no pump, and no telephone sent 2 men out into the rain to light the old steam engine behind the dye house. Because she did not need electricity. She did not need a telephone. She needed coal and water and a man who knew her. She ran a pump for 31 hours. And when the town's siren lost power, they used her whistle. 3 long blasts. That meant get to high ground. For a day and a half, that was the sound the valley went to sleep to and woke up to. What it meant, at 3 in the morning in the dark with the water coming, was that somebody down there was still awake. Somebody was still working. The famous photographs in that box showed the whole machine, side on, the way photographs do. The useful ones showed hands. A hand on the water pump. A hand holding a chisel against a bolt head. And in the fourth one, a boy standing on the driver's step. Small. Soaked through. 14 years old, maybe less. With his fist closed around a cord that hung well below the whistle. Arlo found that one. He did not say anything. He just turned the photograph around on the table so his father could see it right way up. Then Harriet put a second folder down and everything on that machine lined up into 1 week. A repair sheet, dated the last day of August, 11 days after the water went down. It listed 6 stay bolts replaced on the left side of the firebox. It listed a patch plate, and it gave the rivet spacing, and the spacing was tighter than the book called for. It was signed at the bottom in ink, Bert Sales, engineer. The same man who had been standing on that machine in the rain had gone back 11 days later, put her right, and put his name under the work. Nobody in that room knew yet who Bert Sales had been. All they knew was that everything strange about that machine, the crosses in the bolt heads, the too tight rivets, the cord that hung 20 inches too low, came out of the same 11 days in 1 August. The last file was 1 page. A barn fire, long afterward. Everybody said she was cut up for scrap, but there was no receipt for scrap anywhere, in any file, and somebody carried her out of there and never told a living soul. The question had changed while they sat at that table. It was not whether this machine was that machine anymore. It was whether one man was still alive who could say so, and whether he would come. The archive wanted her held under pressure longer, and that meant doing the bolts properly. Dane explained it to Arlo the night before, at the kitchen table, because the boy was going to be the one holding the hammer. A stay bolt is one of the short bolts that ties the inside wall of a firebox to the outside wall and keeps the pressure from pushing them apart. The men who built her drilled a little hole down into the end of every one, Dane said, about 1 inch deep. It's called a telltale hole. What's it for? When a bolt cracks, water finds the crack. Then it comes up that hole and out, and it drips. He turned his coffee cup around. They built her so she'd tell on herself. 107 years ago, and they already knew a man was going to need to know. The other way to find a broken one is a hammer, and it takes 2 people. One gets inside the firebox and holds a heavy hammer against the back of the bolt. The other stands outside, taps the head, and listens. A good bolt rings. A broken one goes dead in your hand. Dane went inside himself and put his boy outside with the hammer. He was not going to put a 13-year-old in a steel box for anything on this earth. So Arlo tapped and called out what he heard, and his father felt every one come back up through the steel into his wrist. Bolt after bolt down the left side. 40 minutes in, the boy said, "That one's wrong." He tapped it again. "Dad, that one's wrong." 2 of the telltale holes were weeping. Not running. Weeping. The way a thing does when it has been holding on a very long time and is nearly finished. Elwood measured the distance between them with a folding rule. He measured it twice. Then he wrote it in the log. 19 inches. "You can't fire her," he said. Elwood, 2 broken bolts inside 24 inches of each other. The old inspector shook his head once. "That's not my opinion, Dane. That's the line. And the line does not move for anybody, including you." He wired a red tag onto her safety valve. And here is the thing worth sitting with. That rule was written by people who had seen what happens when it gets ignored. The only reason a machine like her can be trusted at all is that men like Elwood will red tag her for the man who has everything riding on her. The rule is not the enemy of this story. The rule is why the story is worth anything. 4 days later, the school district let Dane know his maintenance contract would be reviewed elsewhere going forward. Nobody at the district said the word Garrity. Nobody had to. That contract was 28% of everything that came through his shop in a month. 3 people ate out of that number. And the red circle on the wall calendar had come and gone by then. He had let the license lapse. Without the school money, he could not cover the renewal and the bond both. So he paid his people and let the state take his stamp instead. A man who inspects boilers for a living, with no standing to sign an inspection. That is what the $300 had cost him by September. And the repair was a trap inside the trap. Because to put her right, he had to pull out the 2 bolts that were testifying for him. So he pulled them the way you pull evidence, photographed, witnessed, bagged and labeled with the date and the position. 2 new ones cut on his own lathe, threaded by hand, the way the originals had been. Then he called his 3 people in and told them exactly how many weeks of payroll were left in the account. He gave them the number. He did not round it up. The man who had been at his bench 14 years waited until he was finished. Did you put a new boiler under her? No. Then quit offering us the door and give me the call list. Here is the part worth arguing about. $85,000 was still sitting on that table. His payroll was not. Would you have taken it? Tell me down in the comments. I do read them. Because the company had one more thing to try. And it was the thing that finished them. The company's lawyer came at it from the one direction still open to him, and he did it well. He pointed at the red tag on her safety valve. 2 broken bolts and a fresh repair. That, he said, was proof somebody had rebuilt that firebox recently. He demanded the old bolts. Dane put both bags on the table and slid them across. This is the thing about digging for a hole. You have to move the dirt. And sometimes the dirt is evidence too. The bolts were threaded by hand. A machine cuts a thread the same all the way down, and a man does not. Their telltale holes stop short at 1 1/4 inches. The depth written on that repair sheet from August, in the same handwriting that signed the bottom of the page. And down in the threads, there was nothing but slow, ordinary rust. Continuous, undisturbed. Running out of the bolt and into a sheet of steel that had never once been off that machine. The company had gone looking for a hole and dug up the second half of the proof. The lawyer closed his folder a good deal more carefully than he had opened it. But Harriet still would not certify her. Marks prove she's continuous, she said. They don't prove who made the decisions. Find me a man who stood on that step. If he can tell me about that repair before he sees her, I'll sign it myself. There was exactly one such man left alive. His name was Orrin Teasdale. He was 85. He lived 4 hours away. And 2 days before the steam show, his daughter called to say he was thinking about staying home. For 71 years, people had asked Orrin about the flood. How high did the water come? How many died? Were you frightened? Then they asked him to hold still for a photograph. Nobody had ever once asked him who kept the water level in the glass at 3 o'clock in the morning. Harriet did not ask Dane to talk him into it. She photocopied 9 pages out of Arlo's notebook, taped over the name at the top, and put them in the mail. In those 9 pages, the second whistle cord got 1 line. Item. Condition. Witness. It sat between a cracked clamp and a missing washer, and it was given no more room than either. That is what changed his mind. Orrin said he would come, on one condition. If she turned out to be his machine, the permanent record would name the whole crew. Every man on her that August. Not the mill, not the owners, the crew. Dane agreed before he had any idea whether a museum would ever offer him $1. That condition traveled back to Roslyn, and it landed somewhere the money had not. Her father's photographs, the ones that hung in his office 30 years, had a name typed under every man in a necktie. Under the men actually holding something, the caption said, "Workman." Her board had 19 days left on the bank's deadline. The steam show fell on day 15. Their second offer was $180,000. The company would keep her frame in one piece and reserve the right to sell the boiler off separately. Dane turned it down in writing. What made that machine worth anything was the relationship between her parts. A boiler sold to one man and a frame sold to another are not a machine. They are two heavy objects in two different states. Add it up. $85,000 in the spring, $180,000 in the summer. $265,000 he had said no to, while borrowing against his own lathe, his pipe bender, and his truck to make payroll on a Friday. He signed that note at the desk where the $300 invoice lay under a sheet of glass. His hand stopped above the line long enough for Bernadette to notice. You can still take their money. If the archive tells me she isn't the machine, I bring her back under the challenge, and they keep the $300. The contract doesn't ask that of you. No, Dane said. I do. 15 days out. Everything he owned, against a whistle cord and an old man's memory. She traveled in a closed trailer with the archive's seal on the door. Dane followed in his pickup with Arlo beside him and the document box on the boy's lap. And neither of them said much for 40 miles. They had roped off an examination area behind the grandstand. Open to the eye, closed to the hand. By 9 in the morning, there were 400 people at that rope. Most of them men over 60, with a folding chair and a thermos, and nowhere better in the world to be. Orrin came in a wheelchair, pushed by his daughter. Thin through the shoulders, hands swollen up at the knuckles. Harriet took him into a room on the far side of the building, away from the machine, and shut the door. She put 5 photographs down in front of him. One was Dane's engine. The other 4 were engines of the same make and the same years. He picked her out in under a minute, off the space between her front wheels and a dent in the corner of her gear cover. Then, before anybody asked him a single question, Orrin started talking about the patch. Left side, down low. He tapped the arm of his chair. Bert did that one the week after. And the rivets sit too close together on it because he wouldn't trust his own spacing on a job that mattered. He cut the crosses in the bolt heads himself, so whoever came after him wouldn't stand there guessing which ones were his. Nobody in that room had said the word rivets. Then Harriet asked him about the cord. He was quiet a moment. When he answered, he was not talking to anybody in that room. Bert Sales braided that for me on the second night. He looked down at his own hands. I was 14. I couldn't reach the pole with my hands full, and he wasn't having me climb on anything at that hour, not in the wet. The old man stopped. He said a fireman who can't call for help isn't a fireman. He's a boy with a shovel. A man who has been handled by strangers for 71 years can tell the difference between an examination and a show. The difference is that an examination does not care which part of you is interesting. Only then did they bring him out to her. She sat under the tent with her paint gone the color of pond water, the patch showing. One panel still missing off the cab. Dane had refused to polish a square inch of her, and 2 collectors had told him that was a mistake. His daughter set the brakes 10 feet away. Orrin looked at her left side, then at the bolt heads. Then he put his hand out and moved it in under the driver's step without looking down at all, the way a man reaches into a drawer in his own kitchen. His fingers closed on the wooden handle. He did not say anything. He held on to it. His daughter put a hand on his shoulder, and 400 people watched an old man hold a piece of wire that somebody braided for him in the rain when he was 14 years old. Then Harriet laid out the record, in order, with no heat in her voice at all. The mill superintendent's log from that August. The repair sheet 11 days later, signed by Bert Sales. The insurance file that said she came out of the barn before it came down. The $300 invoice with Rosalind's initials beside a line in blue ink. And then an 85-year-old man who had described a repair before anybody let him see it. Harriet signed it herself, the way she had said she would. Elwood and the state inspector went over her cold for 2 hours, and at the end of it, the state man wrote out a certificate and handed it across the rope. They lit her at 2 in the afternoon. Kindling, split oak, coal. 400 people watching a needle. When the pressure came up, Harriet asked Orrin whether he would like to pull the whistle. He looked at the cord a second. "It's not mine to pull," he said, and he tilted his head over at Arlo. "Ask him. He's the right height." The boy climbed up onto the step. Nobody had to show him where the low cord was. He had written it down 4 months earlier, on the first day, on a folding chair, in a notebook with soft corners. He put his hand on the worn wooden handle, and he pulled it 3 times. 3 long. Get to high ground. 400 people went completely silent. And then they did not. An old man in the second row took his cap off and held it against his chest. A woman put both hands over her mouth. And somebody halfway down that rope said out loud to nobody at all, "That's 3 long. That's get to high ground," and then could not say anything else. They were not applauding. It took a moment to understand that. Half of them were crying, and they were men who do not. The company's lawyer had one thing left, and he used it. He argued that a woman running a liquidation has no authority to change auction terms out loud into a microphone, that the whole challenge had been entertainment. That was the only mechanism the company ever really had. Everything else was noise around it. Bernadette did not make a speech. She opened the company's own contract to the page where the board had named Rosalind the officer responsible for the disposal, with authority to adjust the terms of any lot. Her initials sitting right there beside the line, and she slid it across the table. The company's counsel read it twice. Then he released every claim to the machine, withdrew the accusation about the boiler, agreed to correct the public statement, and added a 4th thing without being asked. The shop's service contract would be restored, or paid out for the canceled term. Rosalind had stood at the end of that tent through all of it. Then she asked for the microphone. I called this machine a display piece. She had to stop and start again. I was wrong. I was wrong in writing, and the correction is going in the same place the mistake went. She looked across the tent at Dane. Mr. Vickery kept the evidence when my company did not, and he honored a safety condition that I treated as a joke into a microphone in front of 200 people. Then she said the rest of it. Garrity Machine and Power sold the complete engine. We will honor the sale. 3 weeks later, a private collector offered $400,000. He wanted her stripped, repainted, and fitted with a new boiler, so she could be run at shows without any of the paperwork. Dane said no in 1 sentence. Then the Valley's Industrial Heritage Museum came back with $465,000. For scale, the highest price ever paid at public auction for a rare restored steam tractor was $420,000. And she was not restored. She was original, and original is the rarer thing. Their terms took him 10 minutes to read and 4 seconds to accept. Every authenticated part stays with the machine. Conserve her, do not restore her. Dane comes with her, as the man who runs her steam plant, for 2 years. And Arlo's notebook goes into the collection in a sleeve, the boy's handwriting facing out. Dane added one condition of his own, the one he had already promised an old man he had never met. The label would name Ledbetter and Sons. It would name Bert Sales. It would name every man on her crew that August, and the 14-year-old who kept her fire. and it would name all of them before it listed one single hour or one single flood statistic. $465,000 out of 300. It paid off the lathe, the pipe bender, and the truck. It bought back the license and the bond he had let go in September. And the state put his stamp in his hand again 4 days before the winter inspection started. It put a roof on the shop and an account in Arlo's name, and it started a profit share for 3 people who had worked a whole winter on nothing but his word. He did not buy a bigger house. He bought the tool, the one from the coffee can. And the first job he used it on was a boiler under a grade school 2 towns over. 40 years of nobody looking. He found the shell thin in one place, and he wrote the ticket before he picked up the wrench. The museum opened the hall in the spring. Her paint is still the color of pond water. The patch is still showing. The cab panel that was missing the day Dane bought her is still missing, because no photograph anybody has found shows what was on it. There is one small lamp mounted under the brass plate. Nobody at that museum will say which of them put it there. Orrin could not travel by then, so his voice does the explaining now. There is a button below the driver's step, and if you press it, an old man tells you why that machine has 2 whistle cords on it. Rosalind came, and she did not ask for a reserved seat. She brought a photograph that had hung in her father's office. A hand, a chisel, a bolt head. On the back, in his handwriting, bought with the yard lot. More than a display, I think. Why didn't he tell anybody? Arlo asked. Rosalind took her time with that one. He thought he had more Saturdays. Near closing, Arlo pulled the low cord once. There was no fire in her, so it was only air. A short, soft note that most of the room did not even hear. The plate on her says the fire will try every man's work. It did. What nobody thought to put on that plate is that the fire keeps the answer afterward and hands it over, in no hurry at all, to whoever comes looking 100 years later. Arlo wrote the date in the notebook. If there is a machine or a man that everybody in your town wrote off too early, tell me about it down below.